Hello everyone out there, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. So I have a 101 series on my channel where I have a couple different videos on things like Nutrition 101 and Digestion 101, etc. And I really wanted to do a video on Menstrual Cycles 101, all about the menstrual cycle, periods, cycle phases, tracking, understanding hormones better. And I love this subject. I have tracked my cycle and my periods for so many years. I do it every single month. And so I really wanted to dive into this subject today because I truly believe that as a woman, for those of you out there, for anyone who has a period, being able to track your cycle and just understand your cycle better, your menstrual cycle better, can make a world of a difference in understanding yourself better and how you feel throughout the month and everything that's going on inside of your body. So that's what today's video is all about. So whether you are someone who is maybe new to the world of like tracking your cycle, or maybe you have not even considered this before, or you don't even really know where to begin when it comes to understanding your period and the different cycle phases, or maybe you do know a thing or two about it, but you just want a bit of a refresher, this video is for you. I'm super excited to dive in. So yeah, let's dive in. So let's begin by talking about the menstrual cycle before we dive into the different phases. And I do just want to point out here quickly that I will be talking about kind of like normal or average menstrual cycle lengths here, but of course I just want to point out that everyone's periods, everyone's cycles are very different, and of course there are a number of things that can impact your cycle, such as different health conditions you may have, or medications, or things like the birth control pill. So a menstrual cycle is the time between the first day of your period, the first day of full flow, and the day before your next period. So that is one cycle. And a cycle can range in length anywhere from 21 to 35 days. However, for you wouldn't want to see fluctuations of 21 to 35 days, or in between that month to month. What that means is that for one person, a cycle length of, let's say 25 days could be something that's normal for them, give or take a couple of days. And for another person, a 35-day cycle, give or take a couple of days, can be normal. But for you wouldn't want to see that large of a fluctuation month to month. You'd really only want to see a couple day variation month to month. So the menstrual cycle consists of three specific phases: the follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase. And it is kind of controlled and orchestrated by a group of different hormones, such as gonadotropin releasing hormone, FSH or follicle stimulating hormone, LH or luteinizing hormone, as well as estrogen and progesterone. All of these hormones are at play. Alrighty, so now that we've got that all sorted out, let's dive into the cycle phases, what happens during these phases, and just everything that's going on inside of your body. So beginning with the follicular phase. This is a really fascinating phase of your cycle. So the follicular phase begins on day one of your cycle, which is day one of your period. And that is the first day of full flow, not spotting, none of that. First day of full flow marks the start of a new cycle. This is your monthly bleeding, where your uterine lining is shedding, your endometrium, and menstruation lasts 3 to 7 days on average. And the follicular phase is the phase where your body is preparing to release an egg for what's known as ovulation. So it's kind of preparing for that. So at the very beginning of the follicular phase, and when your period begins, estrogen and progesterone levels are at their lowest. Now what happens is that follicle stimulating hormone is released from the pituitary gland, which kind of leads to a whole bunch of follicles to be stimulated and to grow, about anywhere from 5 to 20 follicles. Now, what on earth is a follicle, you ask? A follicle is a fluid-filled sac that contains your eggs. And so what happens is that FSH, that follicle stimulating hormone, around the beginning of your cycle is released, and it causes a bunch of follicles to grow around the surface of your ovary. And so this continues up toward the middle of your cycle, which is ovulation, which we'll get to in a moment. And what happens is as the follicles grow, one follicle will become dominant, will become the most mature, which will be the one that will release an egg. Bloop, a little egg will pop out of that follicle around ovulation. Now, I had said that estrogen and progesterone are at their lowest at the very, very beginning of your cycle, when you're on like day 1 of your period. But this follicle, and the follicles that are kind of growing and maturing, particularly the dominant one as you reach closer to ovulation, starts to release a lot of estrogen. So you start to have an increase of estrogen being released and in your bloodstream, which makes you feel really good, but it actually plays a lot of different roles. So number 1, all that estrogen helps to stimulate your uterine lining to start to thicken and grow again. That exact same uterine lining that just shed off as your period, it starts to thicken and grow again because your body is preparing for the possibility of a pregnancy. This estrogen also starts to help your cervical, the glands in your cervix to produce a lot of a really slippery, kind of watery egg white cervical mucus, which is a very fertile cervical mucus. And also elevated levels of estrogen signal to your brain that a follicle is at maturity, okay? So you had a whole bunch of follicles that were, stimulated to grow, but only one was gonna become dominant, one will become the biggest. And so all that estrogen that's being produced is telling your brain, hey, we've got a follicle that's super developed and ready to go, and this is what's going to stimulate luteinizing hormone to be secreted, which causes what's known as an LH surge in the body, which prompts your body to ovulate within a day or so. So that is the follicular phase. That's what's going on in your body. And then that kind of, once you ovulate, that marks the end of the follicular phase, and then we move on to ovulation. Let's talk about what you need to know about this phase. What do you need to know about the follicular phase of your cycle? So again, it's the first half of your cycle. It's usually from day 1 to approximately day 14-ish if you have a 28-day cycle. So what do you need to know about this phase? Number 1, at the very beginning of the follicular phase, you're gonna have likely much lower energy levels because of the really low estrogen and progesterone. Those hormones are at the lowest, so you might feel a lot more sluggish and tired. You may feel a sense of relief that some PMS symptoms are starting to diminish as you kind of go through the early days of your cycle. As your period continues, you can maybe start to feel a little bit better mood-wise, energy-wise. It is a great idea to add in some iron-rich foods at the beginning of your cycle when you get your period, because we can lose, a bunch of blood with our monthly period and iron as a result. So things like lentils and dark leafy greens and beans, red meats, poultry, fish, etc. is a great thing to include in your diet at this time, just to kind of replenish some of those iron stores. And lastly, another thing that I want to point out here for you to know about the follicular phase is that if you are not yet tracking your cycle, this is a wonderful thing to start to do, is tracking when you get your period every month. So like I said, I track my period every single month. I have for so many years, probably close to 7 or 8 years now. It's just a really big part of my life every single month is tracking my period. And so you can do this, usually the easiest way to do it is by using an app. So I use the app Clue, but there are a ton of different apps out there that you can just download on your phone, and just the day you get your period, the first day of full flow, and all the subsequent days of your period, you can just track that. And then what's going to happen is over time, you're going to garner a bunch of information about different averages for you, when you typically tend to get your period, how long your cycle length typically is, and even things like estimates on when your fertile window might be or ovulation. They're just estimates here. Nothing is like completely accurate in an app, but still super insightful to know what is normal for you and how long your cycles tend to last, which is great to know. Alrighty, next is ovulation. Let's talk about ovulation, another really fascinating kind of piece of our cycle, our menstrual cycle. So, as I just mentioned, luteinizing hormone, which you get a surge of right before you ovulate, is kind of what precedes ovulation. So you get an LH surge when those estrogen levels are really high, tells luteinizing hormone to get going. Surges, you get a peak, and then you'll ovulate within 12 to 36 hours or so after that peak. What happens is during ovulation, one of those follicles that we talked about that becomes really dominant and mature, it's ready to go, it kind of bursts open an egg. An egg kind of comes out of it, and then it's carried down your fallopian tube, and it's ready to be either fertilized or it will just die and be shed away with your next period. But that is ovulation. So what do you need to know about this phase, about ovulation? So number one, an egg, once it has been, once you've ovulated and it's traveling down your fallopian tube, it's only viable, or it only lives for about 24 hours. Now, your fertile window though is considered a bit longer than that, up to 5 days, because of the fact that sperm can live inside of the female reproductive tract for 3 to 5 days or so. So that is why there's actually more time that you could get pregnant, because the sperm can hang around and wait for the egg to travel on down. Some women feel a lot more productive or energetic around ovulation because you've got really high levels of estrogen, which makes you feel really good in a lot of ways. It's just, it's quite a lovely hormone to be experiencing in higher amounts. So if this is you, take advantage of it. I sure do. I know that when I'm around that kind of phase of my cycle, I tend to have much greater energy levels, I feel more productive, and I just feel better all around. Another thing that you will want to know about ovulation is to keep an eye out for that really stretchy, slippery egg white cervical mucus that I mentioned a few moments ago. So this is a really specific kind of very fertile cervical mucus that the glands in your cervix will produce that again facilitates sperm entry. And it's quite noticeable. It's very, very stretchy. It's different than any other type of cervical mucus that you would typically experience throughout your cycle. It's not tacky or creamy. It's noticeably very stretchy. You can stretch it between your fingers. And so that will happen leading up to ovulation and like on the day of ovulation. And this is really helpful to know the types of fluids that you are producing. If you're taking hormonal birth control, ovulation does not occur. Okay, let's move on to the luteal phase. This is the sort of second half of your cycle, which happens after you ovulate. So it's the time from when you ovulate to when your next period starts. After an egg is released from its follicle and out of the ovary and down into the fallopian tube, what forms from that follicle that just released an egg is what's known as the corpus luteum. So it's kind of like this shriveled up little follicle that's now empty because the egg popped out of it. And what happens is the corpus luteum is what's responsible for producing and releasing lots of progesterone in the second half of your cycle. So it's actually the dominant hormone in the second half of your cycle in the luteal phase, even more dominant than estrogen. Estrogen starts to kind of decrease a little bit. And what is this responsible for? Responsible for much lower energy levels, PMS, etc. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So this steady increase in progesterone now is what helps to support the uterine lining, to keep it nice and lush and cushy for the possibility of a pregnancy. So the corpus luteum has a lifespan of about 14 days or so, give or take a day. Which is the typical length of a luteal phase, meaning that once that corpus luteum completely dies off, it's no longer producing progesterone, which kind of initiates the start of your period. Your uterine lining starts to slough off again and shed. And then that starts a brand new period again and a brand new cycle. So that is the luteal phase, and let's talk about what you need to know about the luteal phase. So number one, you are much more likely to feel very tired, very sluggish during your luteal phase, and again, that's because of the elevated progesterone in the luteal phase. Actually causes you to experience things like fatigue, mood changes, PMS symptoms, sore boobs, things like that. Cervical mucus will also thicken during this time. It's not that nice, stretchy, slippery, watery fluid. It's much thicker and going to be more like cloudy and creamy almost. This is a really good time of your cycle to just take it easy. Generally, try to get more sleep if you can. Just go easy on yourself. Try not to do any like crazy high intensity exercise if you're not feeling it, because a lot of times it's just a time of month where you're gonna be a little lower energy for a lot of people. I personally can attest to this. That is always how I feel in my luteal phase, is just much more tired. I find I sleep a lot better too, because I just have a lot less energy. I have much more like full night sleeps versus in my like follicular phase or ovulation. I tend to have so much more energy and I can be much more like awake at night. And lastly, another thing that you can do that's great here, again, is kind of coming back to tracking things. So really, keep track of any symptoms you might be experiencing during this phase. Keep track of your energy levels, your mood, PMS symptoms, things like that can be really, really insightful. Again, it's coming back to just understanding your cycle more and the different phases that are occurring. and how you're feeling during those different phases versus having no idea why you're feeling so tired or moody. So I think that that is it for today's video, a little menstrual cycles 101. Again, I was just referring to kind of your average cycles. Irregular cycles are things for a totally separate video, although I do have a whole video on how to have a healthy period where I do talk a little bit more about irregular cycles and some things that you can do to support that. I'll leave that video linked below if you want to learn more about having a healthy period. But I hope that you found this video helpful. I also have a whole blog post up on this whole subject if you want to read through everything that I talked about today and the different cycle phases and that. I will leave that linked below. If you have any questions for me, feel free to ask. I love this subject. It's so fascinating to me. So yes, absolutely leave your questions or comments below, and I will see you all in the next one.